Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Aisha Batul, and I'm the current Education Officer of the Ndsa. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a local branch of the RIBA run on a voluntary basis by architects for chartered architects and students, as well as non-chartered architects and those interested in the profession and architectural design. If you'd like to know more about us, you're welcome to check out our website, ndsa.org.uk, or follow us on social media. Before moving on to the presentation, I'll go over a bit of housekeeping. We encourage you to keep asking questions, but keep them until the end. And you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. And if you prefer, or if you don't want to ask a question directly, you can simply type it into the chat. Tonight, we are joined by David Ames of the Letchworth Garden City Heritage Foundation. David is the Executive Director of the Foundation, and tonight he will be sharing about the Letchworth Garden City and its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you're here tonight, you might already know that Letchworth Garden City is the brainchild of Ebenezer Howard. Thank you, David, for taking the time out tonight for us. And before further ado, I'm going to give it to David.
Okay. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. I don't know, but Aisha, if you could pop your screen on and just wave at me if you can see everything. Excellent, thank you very much. I would hate to drone on and you're not actually seeing anything. So thank you so much for that introduction. It's lovely to be here with you. Shame not in person, but it's good to be here anyway. I do come visit Nottingham University normally once a year to do a little bit of work with the students and to do a presentation on Letchworth, which is always really enjoyable. I know we've done some project work with the university in the recent past as well. So I work for Letchworth Garden City Heritage Foundation, and we are the successors to Ebenezer Howard's company called First Garden City Ltd that developed the world's first garden city in Letchworth. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to say a little bit about our history and do look at some of the buildings that if we were doing a walking tour, we might be looking at, which you might be interested in. A little bit about the values and vision which are embedded in the Garden City movement, its influence, both in the UK and further afield, how land value capture works in practice, and then talk about how the COVID situation has impacted on Letchworth and how the Garden City model has performed. So hopefully you'll find that to be of interest. So the Heritage Foundation is a self-funded charitable organisation. So we are a community benefit society, and we have the sole purpose of working for the benefit of Letchworth Garden City communities. In very basic terms, which we'll talk about a little later, we capture value from the land. So when Ebenezer Howard talked about capturing value for the land, we capture value from the Garden City Estate, of which we own the freehold of about 5,500 acres of Letchworth Garden City, and we reinvest that for the benefit of the local community. And we do that through funding, supporting and promoting various activity providing services, additionality for the benefit of the local residents and people who work here. But of course, no story of the Garden City can really take place without mentioning Ebenezer Howard. So I'm sure you've all heard of Ebenezer Howard. He wasn't an architect, he wasn't a town planner. Town planning didn't actually exist when he was doing his work. He was actually a parliamentary reporter who was very, very interested in the way that people live and the way that communities are created. He had worked and spent a lot of time with various writers, people who are interested in property, how property functions, but also how community lives. And he got himself involved with various philanthropic business owners. So you probably would have heard of families like the Cadburys and the Levers and the Rowntrees, so industrialists in the 1800s, and they developed some schemes which, if you haven't looked at, I would commend you to do so, at Port Sunlight, for example, near Liverpool, and Bourneville on the edge of Birmingham. And these are really examples of what could be achieved. And Ebenezer Howard, through his work in Parliament, he was a parliamentary reporter, he was also an inventor. He learned and heard a lot of the stories and the opportunities and what was going on in the world. And he also traveled to America, tried to be a farmer in America, but that gave him the opportunity to look at where things were going very well, actually, in various cities in America, where new developments had taken place. And also he was very well read in terms of what was going on in Adelaide at that time. So in 1898, he put together a book called Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform. And that is really where the whole concept of the Garden City came together. Now, within that, there is a series of core values and principles. People talk a lot about Garden City principles, and we will do so shortly, but it really sets this out in some detail. And what he was able to do, he was able to lay out how an experiment could take place in order to deliver this vision of a garden city, which then he hoped the public sector would take forward and see a whole series of these schemes be delivered as a new way of thinking. At the heart of this was a realization that the whole system of land and how land is traded was flawed. Now, what he'd seen in various circumstances, such as this image here, you've seen people paying very high rents to live in very poor conditions. And there is no sharing of the value that's generated from those rents. So what he called the unearned increments, where people were able to draw a red line around a piece of land, suddenly that was worth a huge amount of money because it had development potential, and the community gained no benefit from that. And something that we face today still, and the planning system has never really been able to tackle. Now, what Howard was able to do was that he actually brought together lots of ideas which were knocking around at that time. And saying that there was the arts and crafts movements and various social thinkers, William Morris, for example, were putting forward these ideas that really we needed to find a better way for people to live, that people were living in very poor sanitation, air quality was extremely poor in the cities, and also working conditions in the countryside were very tough. And what Howard was trying to advocate was a third way, and he was seeking to combine the best of living in the town with the best of living in the country. And this image, as three magnets, is often seen because what he did, and where he was different from many other writers at that time, was that he presented his ideas in a diagrammatic form. So really simple way, and it really captured the imagination of many people. But when people talk about garden cities, they focus an awful lot on the single entity. But in actual fact, that wasn't what he was advocating. He was advocating a regional plan where based around the city. So you'd have the central conurbation, that central city, and then there'd be a series of these satellite towns, these garden cities on the edge, all interconnected, providing a range of facilities. But this wasn't only about providing new places, it was an inner city regeneration model. So when we go back to this image here, what he was trying to do is trying to see these areas redeveloped through a series of garden cities. So people would decant out of the central city into these new garden settlements, each with a maximum population. At the time, he suggested 32,000, with the concept being that once that population had been met, then there would be another garden city developed until we had a series of these with connections between all of them. So a really, really simple idea. But also his model went into great detail in his book about how the finances of that could work. And he put together a whole series of calculations that showed that there could be the capture of value where in the long term, the communities would benefit from the development in these areas, and then there would be a sharing of these and of various forms of community governance, so that then they were able to decide how that money was spent. He didn't advocate a particular architectural style, and it's a common misconception that garden cities are about a particular style. Obviously, the arts and crafts are very, very strong in Letchworth, and when we do our virtual tour in a moment, you will see that. Neo-Georgian, more so in Welling Garden City, but it doesn't have to be that, and it's so frustrating to those of us who are involved in advocating garden cities that we're presented with a so-called new garden city. It doesn't reflect any of the principles, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it just is a quite often poor copy, not always, of early garden city design. So you'll see very traditional buildings with chimneys, rough cast render, in tree-lined corridors. Doesn't make them a bad scheme, but they're not a garden city. The garden city is all about innovation, embracing modern technology. And if you read what Howard said, he was really advocating that it wasn't about a pastiche or preserving something in aspic. It was a revolutionary idea, and also one that needed to evolve. So as I said, Howard wasn't an architect, so he needed some architects to bring forward his vision. And there was a design competition back in 1901 and 1902. And these two gentlemen, Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin, were the successful entries. Now, Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin, they were deeply involved in the Garden City movement, and also they were very well-known arts and crafts architects. For example, they had just master planned the new Earswick development, which was kind of like the precursor to Letchworth, on the edge of York by Joseph Rowntree to serve his sweet factory. Now, they needed to bring forward a vision that embraced those garden city principles which Howard was advocating. And these two architects weren't fantastically well known at the time. There were certainly more famous architects at the time, but since their work in Letchworth, they became well known across the world. So, for example, Raymond Unwin was heavily involved in the post-First World War redevelopments that we see across the UK. He was hugely influential in the RIBA and the Royal Town Planning Institute. Barry Parker was also a president of the Royal Town Planning Institute and was a founder of the Landscape Institute. Parker developed Porto, the master plan for Porto, Withenshaw in Manchester, a series of schemes in Sao Paulo, for example. Unwin heavily involved in the New Deal developments in America, and developments such as Radburn, which were modern interpretations of these Garden City, the Garden City ideal. So they formulated a master plan, which we can see on the left, and I've done a little aerial photograph so you can see how that overlays, so that the first face of the central core. Now, when we look at this master plan, we would think, well, there's nothing really that innovative in that. But in actual fact, it was hugely innovative at the time. We're dealing with Victorian England, the very last days of Victorian England. And in this master plan, Parker and Unwin created walkable neighbourhoods, something we spend a lot of time talking about now. There was a zoned approach where industry was set away from where people were living. It was surrounded by a belt of agricultural land. So the principle, there was a lot around food, local food production in what Howard was saying. So in principle, the town could feed itself. There was within walking distance of every home, people could walk to their work, they could all cycle, they could gain easy access to public open space, they could walk to the town centre, and the train station was in the mid, or is still in the middle of the town centre. So this is very much in tune with what we would advocate today in planning new places. But it's interesting when we look at the losing entries to the design competition, where they were building homes right next to where people would be working. So smoke, air quality was a massive issue at that time, and sadly still is. Now, the way that we can measure the success of that is if we look at in the founding years of Letchworth, so the first 20 or 30 years or so, It was far superior to other towns and cities in terms of child mortality. The air quality was so much better. The quality of work was good, but it was really tough in those early years because it was all privately funded. It was funded through philanthropic investments, a limited dividend of 5%. There was no government money at all. It's entirely privately funded. We are still an entirely private organisation that look after the Garden City Estate. Ebenezer Howard said that he would be waiting forever if the public sector was to take on these ideas. That's why he bought the land, took a punt. He had no money himself. He was a very poor man. He got some investors, people like Roundtree, Lever, Cadbury, who had delivered workers' towns for their employees, and they sunk the money in, and then they sought investment as the development came forward. And it took a very long time to repay that till the 1950s for all of that debt to be cleared. So it took a huge risk. But I think the interesting thing is, and I've worked on various schemes across the country, is that if you were to roughly overlay the master plan on the left with the central area as to how Letchworth was developed, it's pretty well in line with the master plan. So they stuck to their principles, even though it was very tough. So to get a flavour of the speed of the development, it stuttered. It was tough times. Obviously, we have the First World War. So the yellowy sort of colour we can see there, those areas. This is residential areas that we're highlighting. These were developed up till 1919. The orange area from 1920 to post Second World War. And then we have the additional estates which were added after the Second World War, some of which were compulsory purchased by the local authorities, as was the case in most Hertfordshire towns. You can see on the right-hand section, the prime industrial area, and Letchworth has the biggest industrial estates in North Hertfordshire, and they're absolutely core to the application of the Garden City principles. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to try to give you a flavour of Letchworth, how it looks today, and how that master plan has bedded in. Because of course, it's important how things look when we first develop them, but it's equally as important 100+ years later on. So we have some aerial photographs here. This is Broadway Gardens, which we can see in the centre. You will see that in pretty well, this type of approach in pretty well every garden city scheme in the world, of which there are many. So you'll see the axial routes coming off the central square. Howard said that he wanted a town square, the original idea being that there would be a series of major civic buildings in this area. That didn't quite happen. Now we have large gardens and fountain, but you can see Barry Parker was really pushing the tree line corridors. You have a double verge running up to the north there that we can see in this image. Again, we can see this is a shot of the town centre, and then to the top of that image, the planned common, which is now a local nature reserve in the Parker and Unwin plan. They wanted to make sure there's a major piece of common land for everybody to gain easy access to, and there it is, and it's an absolutely amazing asset to the town. And looking at some of the buildings, I've said heavy arts and crafts influence that we will see without on the early structures. This is the rail station, which is a listed building, and say the station is in the centre of the town deliberately so. There needs to be some improvements in this area, to be honest with you, and that's something that will be happening over the next couple of years, where we'll rationalise some of the uses and activities there. But important to have that at the core. So many towns and cities find themselves with stations a little bit out on the edge, so forth. This is not the case here. This building here is the estate office. Originally, this was a single-storey building, and this was in the middle of a field. It's opposite the station. There was nothing else there. When they bought the estate, it was an agricultural estate. There was nothing there at all. And this was a single-storey building, and that's where they sold the lots, where people could purchase single plots or small groups of plots to be developed, all of which they had to present a design. Parker produced a series of what we'd now call design code and a series of standards and regulations. At a time when their sanitation so forth was very poor, had to have inside facilities. gardens. Light was really important. So none of these things were being discussed at that time, or certainly being pushed by public authorities. And all of these things, Barry Parker had to agree every single development before it was implemented to ensure that it met with the overall vision that they had for the estate. This is an example of industrial buildings, and there was a number of companies, and it was tough. It was tough to attract companies to start off with. But Spirella was a corset factory, an American company that came to Letchworth purely on the back of the vision and values that the Garden City had. And they, at a time when hundreds and thousands of people were sadly losing their lives at work, working in very poor conditions, particularly in the cotton and clothing industries, Spirella came over from America purely because they absolutely embraced the vision, and they promoted education for their female members of staff. They had libraries. There still is a ballroom in that building for staff recreation. They had someone who would repair bicycles every day if it rained. Members of staff were issued umbrellas for their journey home. This building is owned by the Heritage Foundation. It's been converted into offices, a Grade 2 style listed building. You can see very strong architectural values here, and it makes a major contribution to our income as a let office space. Letchworth, as I said, had some tough times in its early days, and where it managed to get itself really very much on the public domain was through competitions. Excuse me. So in 1905, it had a major exhibition of cottages that could be built for £100 at that time. And we can see some of the entries here. It brought tens of thousands of people to Letchworth. It was promoted by a national newspaper, the Daily Mail, and they promoted this. It brought thousands and thousands of people to Letchworth, and it got it moving, and it made a major contribution. And what you'll see on the streets where we have these exhibition cottages, they're all different. Some didn't survive. There was a house made entirely out of asbestos. There was a roundhouse. There was early innovation around concrete. Some of those didn't make it, but generally those properties are still there, individually architect designed, developed within the price range, and that creates a really interesting legacy. I mentioned the planned common in the centre of the town, and here it is here, Norton Common, a wonderful asset. It's looked after by the local authority, an absolute asset to the town, and beautiful, particularly during COVID, which we'll talk about a little later. Second competition in 1907, exhibition cottages. This was a slightly higher price bracket, and we can see some of the examples there. So these are two of the entries, very different architectural approach, and really pushing innovation, and that's something which we really need to capture now. Very typical of a Parker and Unwin design, where they sought to try to make places comfortable where people wanted to live. And they looked at what at that time was quintessential high quality housing in the UK, and they promoted the village green concept. And this is one of those examples, a place called West Home. If you go to Hampstead Garden Suburb, you'll see an East Home. So a very similar approach. Village green, these are workers' cottages, all now listed, that are around that green, and a well-used space, and could be used for local food production. So very much there was a lot of an eye on how people grow their own food, because the idea was that people who live there would be almost self-sufficient in terms of food production. And what you see here is it's a very simple design, and what you would expect if you would say Garden City design, you would probably sketch this out. But what they did try to do was to make it very comfortable, but also each of those groups, each of those blocks are very slightly different. So they tried to just break it up a little bit in terms of the built form. And that's something which has been retained and protected today. There's a huge intention that it would be a town for workers. And whereas a lot of the other garden city schemes have become significantly gentrified, Hampstead Garden Suburb being an example, the intention behind Letchworth is it would be a town for workers. And there's a huge number of workers' cottages on streets such as this is the local Common View. And that has direct pedestrian links into the industrial estate. So the idea is that people would be able to walk or cycle very easily to work from these locations. Very simple design. These places were built around the late 1910s, early 1920s. Simple design, but that has endured and continues to be very desirable. It's not all about residential. We have 15,000 people who work in Letchworth, roughly 1 job per household on average. And we have a significant industrial portfolio. And here is an example of some of the premises that we have in our estate. And it's also about where we're creating new areas. This is a newer part of the industrial estate that we embrace some of those early design principles. So we can see a tree-lined corridor here, picking up some of those early design principles applied by Parker and Unwin. Have a huge legacy of heritage housing, and that brings beautiful street scenes, but also it brings its challenges. So here we see, again, very typical Letchworth homes, those design features that you would expect to see in the development of that era. And the designs that Parker and Unwin produced were copied all over the UK, but also all over Europe and further afield. You can walk in certain parts of Germany, for example, and you will see pretty well the exact same housing that we see here. But this creates challenges. So what we have here, we have a management scheme where if you wish to change your property, any external alterations, obviously you need planning permission in the usual way, but also you require our consent, because us and a small number of towns across the UK have a scheme of management. For example, the Belgravia Estate in London, Calthorpe Estate in Edgbaston in Birmingham, Hampstead Garden Suburb, Port Sunlight, Bourneville, Welling Garden City, Dulwich Estate are examples of this. So we originally sold everything on a leasehold basis. When people were allowed to purchase their freehold, they can do so. But there are covenants on that property that says you cannot change anything externally without our approval. So that means we control windows, doors, roof tiles. You can't lay a hard standing without our consent. You can't remove a tree. So it provides an additional tier of control, which means that we get about 800 applications a year that we have to determine. It's a legal obligation on us to determine those, and we're able to control some of the key features. So on this property here, for example, those chimneys, they cannot be removed. The windows, that design, you can't alter those. But it also creates challenges because these homes are all solid wall construction, so they're very inefficient. A third of our housing stock is for socially rented accommodation. This means that we have people on very low incomes having to pay very large fuel bills. And that's a challenge that we will have to face, and we are trying to face at the moment in order to find a way that we can balance the heritage of the town. But it's so very essential that they remain to be livable, because we couldn't be moving further away from the Garden City principles if people on low incomes can't afford to live here. It was also, the early phases were designed to be 10-year blind. So here we have an example of some private and some socially rented housing. They have the same level of control and protections on them. They were designed in the same way. So the image on the left is socially rented, the ones on the right are private. But also you can see how the scheme of management has kicked in and how it protects the quality of the street scenes. You can see the front hedges, they're protected. The roof tiles, the chimneys, the windows, all these key features, because although there's lots of beautifully designed properties, not so many of them stand on their own merits. So I've shown you some examples that perhaps arguably do. But it's all about the group and preserving the group. So when we're designing new places, we're designing beautiful street scenes, we need to preserve the group, because the group on its own has a huge heritage value. As I said, this is an example of socially rented accommodation. This was originally communal housing. Ebenezer Howard was really trying to promote communal housing. This was accommodation provided for widows from the First World War who lived together, all of whom were working women trying to support their families, and they had communal kitchens, communal gardens, and this remains socially rented accommodation but of a hugely high quality in terms of its appearance. And here again, we see some very typical Letchworth housing. Unwin pushing in his work around the focal point at the end of streets, which we can see here, creating vistas through tree-lined boulevards, really important parts of those design principles, which can be applied today without taking a particular architectural style. Again, we see another example of a tree-lined street. The protected front hedges, that lovely chimney stack there, for example, is absolutely protected. None of these are listed buildings. Town centre is a really key part of what we do, and we actually own we directly rent out. We own the freehold of the town centre. We directly rent out half of the premises, and the reason for that is not only to create an income, but Howard said that it's really important that the successor organisation should be able to support and manipulate the local market for the benefit of the community. This is something that we still try to do today. This cinema is ours. We're very, very proud of it. It's a beautiful Art Deco building and an absolute modern facility. If it wasn't for this organisation, this cinema would not exist because it receives a subsidy, which means that we can provide ticket prices at around £8 a person, and that for an adult ticket, £1 for children weekend. All of these sorts of things we're able to provide in a 4-screen cinema, which is also now being converted so it acts as a dual use for a theatre. Really important facility for the local community. As is always the case with street scenes, it's always good to look up as well as at ground level. And you can see certainly on 3 of those images, those original design features coming out from the Parker and Unwin principles. The importance of addressing corners. They spoke an awful lot about how corners need to be addressed. In the bottom right corner, you can see that is a Parker and Unwin building where it addresses into the street. Pretty miserable day when I took these pictures. But we invested £9 million in the street scene to help act as a catalyst to support the town centre. Again, some more shots of the town centre, a beautiful arcade, which we rent the units out, and various little, at the bottom right is a community garden that we provide, run by volunteers. People can pick anything that they wish out of that garden at the right time of the year. So looking at a lot of that incredible edible approach that we see in various places now. Some more buildings of interest that popped up. Letchworth became a place for philosophers and thinkers, and became known for as being a town of vegetarian and cranks in some of its early days. And we have some of these buildings, a Folly building, which was where people went for meditation and research and lectures. It's now a Masonic hall, but a really, really interesting building. Sadly, a building at risk at the moment because its maintenance is quite a challenge for the tenants. There was a pub, but Letchworth had no alcohol in it until the 1950s. This is another Grade 2 style listed building called the Settlement, and this was originally the Skittles Inn, and it was a pub that served no alcohol. We have lots of people who were sat in that establishment looking really miserable because there was no alcohol. Everybody says that that's because Ebenezer Howard was a Quaker. He was not a Quaker. The town was not run and owned by Quakers. A common misconception. Barry Parker became a Quaker in later life. It was because Ebenezer Howard spent a lot of time in the city of London, and he'd seen the damage that alcohol had caused, and he didn't want his Garden City ruined by that. But it was open to a public vote. Every few years they had a vote, and then in the 1950s they eventually agreed to allow alcohol in the town. So now we have pubs like everywhere else, but it wasn't until the 1950s. Lots of landmark buildings. This is in the town centre, the former town hall. Again, very typical of this era, designed by Barry Parker. This is another building designed by Barry Parker, which they almost used as a show home to sell some of their concepts. And this was where Parker and Unwin designed many of the buildings, and is now International Garden Cities Institute. Another typical example of a Parker building in the town square area, and that was a school. So got a flavour for how certainly the early parts of Letchworth look. But what we do really like to emphasise is that the place is not preserved in aspect. It's not a museum piece. It's a constantly evolving, vibrant local community. So when we look at Letchworth today, our estate is 5,500 acres. So we own the freehold of that estate. We have control over most of that. Now, population has grown to 35,000. We have double the national average of socially rented housing, which does have an impact on the local economy. It means sometimes the town centre struggles a little bit, but it's absolutely at the heart of the Garden City, a town for workers, not the gentrification that we see in many other examples. 15,000 people work here, as I said earlier, roughly equates to one home per dwelling. As you would expect in a location such as Letchworth in North Hertfordshire, we have a lot of people who commute out into London and a large number to Cambridge as well. And all the lights have gone out. I'll sort that out in a moment. But we have a net balance between the people who move in, who come into work every day, to those who come out. And that's a really important for a town of this nature. So when we talk about Garden City principles, there's a large number of misconceptions. I think that Howard summarized it very easily by it's about grasping the best of the town and the country. So a perfect combination was what he was seeking. But also there was a series of principles which underpinned that. And I'm going to quickly flick the light on because I can't see my notes. So bear with me for 1 second. Right. Lovely, thank you. And there's a series of principles, and then you can't just pick and choose them. It's a full suite of principles. It's about creating beautiful places where people want to live, work and play, absolutely at the heart. As I said, high quality design, but not a particular design style. And that's as I said, is often a misconception. What differentiates a garden city from any other development is long-term stewardship, community ownership of assets, community governance. So, and finding ways of capturing value from the land to reinvest for community benefit. And that is what we do. And we are the only garden city at scale who has protected those core values and principles. So the way that we do that is through a predominantly property portfolio in the Letchworth Garden City estate. We get an income from that, and that is then reinvested into the physical, economic and social infrastructure of the town. We are a self-funded charity that only works for the benefit of Letchworth communities. And we provide additionality. So we do not sweep the streets. We do not provide the statutory services that you'd expect the local authority to do. We provide additional facilities. So let me give you an example of a normal year. So I've deliberately gone back to our accounts in 2019, because obviously things changed a little bit during the COVID time. So in a normal year, we receive around £12 million of income. Now that income would leak out of any other town in the country pretty well. The greater proportion of that is from the property income. So from flats, mainly offices, industrial buildings, shops, and also the agricultural estate. So all of these things combine to around £9.5 million a year income. Then our venues top that up to around 2.5, although there is some subsidy there. We're able to spend about £7 to £7.5 million each year back in the community through our charitable objects. So there's a set of very clear defined areas set out in an Act of Parliament that says where we can spend this money. Now the reason that that's not the whole 12 million is that it costs quite a lot to look after that portfolio. So this is the actual charitable spend, not what we spend on looking after the portfolio. Our asset value is around £160 million. So what this means is that we're able to spend in the town on a range of services and grant support. So I mentioned the cinema, the theatre, a studio and gallery, museum services, so adding to the cultural enrichment of the local community, all heavily subsidised or in many cases free of charge. We invest significantly in the environment through biodiversity projects, habitat creations, and also we have a greenway which surrounds the town, which is a very, very strong facility, a 13-mile route around the town. We look after around 2,500 acres of rural estate that surrounds the town. We have the scheme of management, which I mentioned, where you need consent, but there's no fee for that if you put an application prior to submission. We have a collection of 300,000 objects on Garden Cities, a grants programme of over £400,000 each year. That provides a range of grants from education programmes for the under fives who are struggling, dementia nurses for local residents. We help support the Citizen Advice Bureau and pay for a debt advisor. We provide a range of educational facilities. There's the full suite of things that we can do where possible to support the community. We support pretty well most of the sports clubs. We provide grants for various small activities right up to major capital works like new sporting facilities. All of these are funded through capturing value from the estate. A really simple idea that the rent that someone pays, it goes back into community. If we sell a piece of land for development, that value is captured and then used back for the community. We also, until last year, had our own day hospital treatment centre and a community transport service. All of these things contribute to the enrichment of the local community and does not happen elsewhere. We have a community governance model. I won't dwell on this for too long, which means that local people decide how that money is spent. So I'm an executive director for the foundation. I can't make the major strategic decisions. They have to be agreed by the board. I then have to get on with what the strategy that the board say. And that's made up from governors, which are either elected from local people, nominated by local groups. So all those clubs and societies get to have governors who represent their interests. We appoint general governors to meet a certain need on our governance structure. They then choose a board of 9 people, and they're the ones who make decisions. So a very, very independent of the executive team way of doing it, and a very important part of the Garden City model, absolutely in line with what Howard was trying to do. So the Garden City model has had huge influence. There are around 200 garden cities across the world. Now, when we look across the world, we think, well, what examples when in every continent there is a garden city or a place which is significantly influenced, either from an architectural point of view or from those values and principles. So you can go to the Czech Republic and go to a place called Zlín. That is a garden city developed by the communist government. Looks very different to Letchworth, but those principles are there, so which is really interesting. Some of the suburbs of Paris, Staines, a garden city scheme, they identify themselves with Ebenezer Howard. Canberra in Australia, garden city development. Hellerau in Dresden. A series of suburb schemes in Sao Paulo. Barry Parker went over to Brazil to design, master plan those. Lutyens in Delhi, a garden city development. Podkova in Warsaw in Poland. Whole series in Australia, Colonel Light Gardens, for example. In America, the New Deal towns such as Greenbelt and Greendale. Go into the 1980s, 1990s, Seaside in Florida, new urbanist development, absolutely based on garden city principles. And then in the UK, it spread very quickly, particularly influencing suburban development in terms of the architectural style. But here we can see on the top left, Brentham Garden Suburb, Welling Garden City, which everyone's familiar with, just celebrated its centenary. Wythenshawe in Manchester, the largest public sector garden city scheme, sadly, through sticking a motorway through the middle of it, absolutely ruined Parker's plan. Hampstead Garden Suburb, bottom right, designed by Parker and Unwin. All really, really important developments, all influenced by Parker and Unwin and the Garden City movement. And when you look at the master plan of Porto, for example, Parker is there. So a really, really important impact on the way that we design places across the world. But also in the UK, there's a direct link between the new towns, the post-Second World War new towns, and the Garden City movement. And we can see that we have 2 million people living in new towns in the UK. First scheme just down the road in Stevenage, right the way through to Milton Keynes. And of course, now we have a new series of Garden City influenced developments, although arguably don't actually meet Howard's principles. So whether they are true garden cities or not is a debate for another day. But if we look at this image here, if we look at London, then we look at Howard's social city model. There it is. It's absolutely applied. So the new towns and the principle of a series of satellite towns around the main conurbation around London in this instance was applied by the government after the Second World War for the new towns. So I'm going to finish off by talking about how Letchworth and the Garden City Master Plan and the organisation has performed during the COVID pandemic. Now, the areas that I'm going to look at is around how the master plans worked, how we as an organisation, Ebenezer Howard successor company, probably never envisaged this situation, and how the local community has also responded. So I think the starting point is that we've been here before, very sadly, in that when we look at the flu pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1917 through to 1919, it's exact same situation, although estimated that between 20 and 50 million people lost their lives to the flu pandemic, but this situation arose again. So a little case study is Pineland in South Africa. So on the edge of Cape Town. Cape Town suffered particularly badly from the flu pandemic. And it was partly due to troop movements towards the end of the First World War. Sir Richard Stutterford, the guy on the bottom right there, he was kind of like the John Lewis stores of the day. So he owned department stores in Cape Town. And he was a hugely influential local politician. He'd visited Letchworth, he'd met Ebenezer Howard, and then during the flu pandemic had seen the dreadful impact of poor living conditions. Around 140,000 people died in Cape Town alone. And that was in part due to cramped living conditions, poor sanitation, poor air quality. And he lobbied very hard saying, well, hang on, Ebenezer Howard has promoted another way of living, and so many people wouldn't have lost their lives if we'd applied that. And he pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually brought forward a development called Pinelands. Here's the master plan of Pinelands. Appreciate you can't see too much of that, but if you go to Pinelands, you see tree-lined routes. The master plan was produced by Albert Thompson, who worked for Parker and Unwin. He went over to South Africa to work on this scheme. He also worked on Hampstead Garden Suburb. And you can go down Letchworth Street, Welling Avenue, and the town centre is called the Howard Centre. The influence is hugely there. And they have managed to keep some of the reinvestment principles. So they have some land ownership there. And it's basically a large housing association is able to provide housing for local people. Obviously, there are other side issues with any development in South Africa at that time around apartheid and so forth. My understanding, I haven't had the pleasure of going to Pinelands, is that it is now a mixed community, but I think that like a lot of South Africa, there is a checkered past. But just trying to show that the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic led to a lot of garden city developments across the world when politicians, businessmen and so forth, local communities had seen the damage that poor living conditions had in terms of the spread of that particular pandemic. And we think, and we are seeing that the interest and influence of the Garden City movement is again being promoted on the back of COVID. So I think it's a fair question as to how our master plan, our Garden City has performed in the pandemic. Now we have, as you would expect in the Garden City, it's homes with gardens, and that is across 10 years. So the large chunk of socially rented housing has the same amount of garden as the private homes in general, particularly valued. Walkable neighbourhoods, all of those principles that we spoke about when I discussed the original Parker and Unwin plan, performed hugely well. Our open spaces were so well used and so well regarded, and people really started to look after them far better. We've not had major problems with litter and so forth, but various community groups were formed to make sure they were looked after to support us and the council and the various bits we look after. There's a large amount of allotments, more than you would get in most other places in Letchworth, and lots of community growing space, gained a huge amount of popularity, whereas we had some vacancies, they were all filled. And the town centre, because it's very spacious, became a far more attractive location with far more dwell time. Our Greenway, which is the route that I mentioned previously, 13-mile route that goes around the whole of the town. Originally, early days of lockdown, some real nervousness around use of it. We had to close the car parks, which was a pretty miserable day when I had to do that. But we opened everything as quickly as we can. Fantastic level of usage. The level of usage of the Greenway has grown and continues to be very well used. Our family farm at standalone, highest numbers ever this year, because people are appreciating the open spaces. We were worried about that, whether that increased usage would lead to conflicts between cyclists and walkers, dog walkers. We haven't had any problems, less problems than we would historically have. Greater understanding that it's difficult to look after things during this time. The sea of complaints reduced, even though we had some challenges. And as I said, litter, not a problem. So really, really strong use of those local facilities, far more than was the case previously. So showing that those early principles have performed well. So here's some examples of some of the very well used spaces. I mentioned Norton Common below. You can see this is in the town centre, the top image, the gardens, really well respected, well used, and well regarded. And we're noticing that as lockdown eases and people going back to their normal lives, the level of usage is higher. I said allotments, we were looking at around 25% vacancy on our allotments. We now have a major waiting list. People are really appreciating the allotments. And the town centre is really, really interesting. So you can see some of the investment that we've had in the public place with the sculptures there and the York stone that we added. Initially, town centre struggled, and I'll say in a moment how we help support that. Now our footfall is caught up, nearly there to where it was before, but the businesses are thriving far more because people are appreciating their local areas. We've got great spaces. We're starting to develop co-working spaces, and with folk spending part of their week working from home, they're able to really appreciate their immediate living environment. Perhaps many of them who are commuting into London, they didn't really have an opportunity to appreciate what was around them. They really are now. And we're seeing some really promising times for the town centre. You can see the spaciousness of it, which made a lot of people feel comfortable in the early days of trying to return to normality and in between lockdowns. And here's one of our tenants here when they reopened. So as an organisation, you would have seen when I went through our sort of standard year, we heavily rely on property income. Property income was hit very badly. That exposed the organisation, and there is clearly a discussion to be had around diversification of our portfolio. We had a major loss of income pretty well overnight. Businesses weren't paying their rent. And sadly, we lost around 30% of our staff, which was a dreadful, dreadful time. We're now looking at how we should work in the future. So We have a similar model to the Parks Trust at Milton Keynes. They have diversified their portfolio, but our portfolio enables us to help shape the local economy as well. So it's not all about income. So there's a really interesting discussion, but we had to act very quickly in order to save the organisation and to protect Howard's legacy. But we did some very, very positive work because we can act in an agile way. And I don't expect you to read these, but just some examples of what we're able to do. So, for example, before the government had even announced any subsidy for local businesses, the day that it was intimated there was going to be lockdown, we'd set up community support before anybody else. It's the model which was rolled out across the county, called the Lechworth Model. So that meant that overnight we had 24-hour support for any of our local residents. We got their shopping, their prescriptions. We had helplines set up. We had the partnership set up with groups like the Salvation Army, local supermarkets, and that was done immediately. We used our community transport system to get stuff moved around the town needed to support the local community. Overnight, that was set up and funded. And those partnerships continue today. We also gave rent relief to our retail and leisure tenants before the government announced any sort of financial support. So we gave them a rent holiday immediately, knowing that that would have a major impact on their income, but we needed to look on the long term. And because we're not a political organisation, we can think and work in a long-term manner. Really important. We saved those businesses. There's no doubt about it. And I think it's fair to say in the town centre, literally one or two have been lost. And that's it. And those units have been filled immediately because of the bounce back that we're getting. Supported citizens' advice, provided grants for recovery for local groups so they could continue to operate and be there, including sports clubs, and be there when things return back to normal. And then we continue to support with community awards, recognising those groups have done a fantastic job in helping the local community. Really important contribution that you just simply wouldn't be able to do if you were reliant on the statutory services, all of whom have done a fantastic job, but we provide that additionality and the speed and the pace to provide the reassurance. So then just to kind of wrap up on COVID, then just a few sort of concluding thoughts. I think that what COVID highlighted is that we are reliant on a single form of income, i.e. property rent, in a single place. Clearly that has lots of benefits, but also it does create some challenges. And that will mean that we'll need to look at that in the future. The master plan performed well. The Parker and Unwin, they're here today, should be very proud of themselves. There's walkable neighbourhoods, the wide spaces, homes with gardens, everyone access to open space, worked well. There's no doubt about it. The number of inquiries that the local estate agents are getting from people, mainly from London, who are living in very expensive apartments, now want to get out and they want to come to places like Letchworth. And that is having, I'd say it's a negative in that the price rises are jumping quite swiftly, but certainly places like Letchworth, Garden City and other towns in Hertfordshire are getting a large number of inquiries. Local food production, really going back to what Howard was trying to advocate, has benefited from this, and we were able to act swiftly. We don't have the barriers that some public agencies have, and we were able to support our communities very, very swiftly. We also are now looking to see how we can support the long-term impact. Youth unemployment is a big issue here. Skills is a major issue. We're trying to look at ways that we can support that, not through direct delivery, but finding the right partner. And at the moment, our biggest challenge is finding the right people to work with, to give our grants to, because the community infrastructure and the local authorities infrastructure has clearly been harmed as people have their emphasis elsewhere. So lessons learnt that we can take on to other places, these exciting places that hopefully we'll all be working on. Garden city design is still very relevant. And when I talk about garden city design, I do not mean a particular architectural style. I mean those principles of walkable neighbourhoods, tree-lined corridors, homes with gardens, access to open space, communal gardening, all of these sorts of things are really, really important and need to be reflected. We need to ensure that our accommodation is flexible because needs will continue to evolve. Who would have thought several years ago that everyone will be working from home, or that the demand to house elderly relatives would increase so much? So it's so important, and something that I push really hard on any new development in Letchworth. It has to provide flexible accommodation to meet a whole lifetime of needs. There is a greater appreciation of our open spaces and food resilience. So that is something which we will hopefully be able to develop. Like many other places, people are now wanting to work from home, and lots of Letchworth residents who have now gained a greater appreciation of their environment are looking to find ways to work either very locally or from home. That's something that we will continue to develop, particularly in our office sector, which is struggling a little bit, as is the case in most places. And then finally, our local town centre that is meeting local needs can thrive. And town centres have often been written off, and what COVID has shown is the importance of what's down the end of your road and what you can gain access to. And it does create an opportunity for us. So that is me done, I think. My email address, if anyone wants to contact me directly, is on the bottom of the page there. If any of you want to bring your colleagues or clients or friends or whatever to visit Letchworth, please do contact me. We'd be very happy to do a walking tour with you. We only ask for a small donation, particularly if you have a commercial client. If you're just coming as a university or something like that, there would be no request for that. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour of Garden Cities. The one thing that I ask people to take away when we talk about Garden Cities is it is not, as I've said a number of times, an architectural style. A garden city is a social, community and economic model. That's what it is. And if you can, next time that you're talking about a garden city, ask those questions. Where's the long-term stewardship? How are they capturing value for community benefit? And how does community governance dictate how the place is looked after as part of a long-term stewardship model? If they don't know the answers, or the answers is no to those questions, it isn't a garden city. Thank you. Stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, David. This was a fantastic presentation. I think it's very well timed, and we can see from the chat that there are a lot of questions as well coming up for you, and especially in the light of COVID and the government planning white paper. So I'm just going to go in no particular order, but our first questions from Paul, who's the Honorary Secretary at Ndsa. He's asking, what are your thoughts on the prospects of Garden City values and principles being incorporated into new developments in light of the government planning white paper?
I think it's a really interesting point. We've been lobbying for years and years with the Town and Country Planning Association, who do a fantastic job around garden cities. Firstly, that there was an understanding of what those principles are, and that they should be part of today's planning, particularly when we talk about new settlements. The principles are embedded in planning policy at the moment, not as strongly as we would perhaps like to see, but they are there, and we feel that there is still opportunity for them to be part of, well, who knows what's going to happen in terms of planning reform. It's all a little bit up in the air at the moment. I think the important thing is an appreciation for those of us who advocate Garden City principles. Is it does go back to the question of land, the thing that Ebenezer Howard was tackling all those years ago, in that if you're trying to apply long-term stewardship models, once the land has been acquired and the planning application's in, it's too late. It's just too late. Where it has to be factored in is before that land is purchased, because ultimately there needs to be a very serious and adult conversation about land values, because that's where the challenge lies. And landowner expectations are such that it's very difficult to apply these models. If you look at a piece of land in North Hertfordshire, it's worth £10,000 an acre agricultural value. It's worth in excess of £1 million if it gets an allocation in the local plan. Section 106 and SIL does not touch the sides in terms of capturing value for community benefit. And we do need to look at the whole system of land. So it is difficult to apply it in its purest form, but it's not impossible. If it's set out early days, that's an opportunity. Also, perhaps not in the purest form that we see in Letchworth. And I would commend you to the Parks Trust at Milton Keynes to see what they've done, in that they've set up a trust which looks after huge amounts of open space as part of the new town, with a modest commercial portfolio that they've reinvested, and that provides that income. So there are different ways it can be done, not necessarily at the scale, but really difficult. And those of us as advocates need to keep on pushing to say that this is the way that we think it should be done to meet those principles.
Thank you. I think along those lines, another question from Paul is that, are there any contemporary examples of similar town cities in the UK or developments that show it is possible to emulate achievements, for example, the democratization of capital expenditure of Letchworth Garden City today?
No. So what's certainly not at the scale, certainly not at the scale of Letchworth, but there are some examples of smaller developments. So if you look, for example, Joseph Rowntree did a scheme at Derwentthorpe near York, which was a modern interpretation of the New Earswick development. Certainly you can see that there. The Bourneville Village Trust have done some small new settlements. Again, you can see some of those values, communities leading how on the major decisions, capturing value to ensure things are looked after correctly, those sorts of things. Also, interestingly, an unexpected source of where this is also perhaps being possible is actually with the gentry. So, for example, if Lord Salisbury, who owns most of Hertfordshire, I think, he's putting forward some garden village schemes, and he's very much trying to ensure that some of those principles are applied, so that there is community benefit linked to those developments. So there are some examples, but not at the scale. The new towns should have, and this is what happened with the new town movement, in that the intention was that development corporations would deliver the scheme, what Howard was saying, and then there'd be a successor organisation that would gain the assets. So then they had the long-term source of income, and then they would be able to do some of the things that we do, probably at a bigger scale. When the Conservative government of in the early 1980s sold the assets of the new towns, that was the end of that, and still proves to be a challenge, because it's also about looking after things. The very simple adage, if you build something at the same time, it will deteriorate at the same time. You need to have one great big sinking fund in place, and if that could be through some sort of community ownership model, more is the better. So some smaller examples. Sadly, the new towns weren't able to get what had been the original intentions, but nothing at the scale of Letchworth.
Well, thank you. I think Sarah's question is, you may have answered some of it. She says, I can add to the list of most cities built by the French protectorate in Morocco in the early 1900s, as French urbanists were very influenced by the movement. Do you believe that councils can reproduce the work your organization is doing at the national scale in the UK? What would be the biggest obstacles?
Councils present the best opportunities to do this because they have compulsory purchase powers, and legislation needs tidying up, but a proactive local authority can do several things. Firstly, it can compulsory purchase an agriculture plus land value. So where you kind of need to be. So the landowner is getting a decent amount for the land, but it's acquired at a price that then enables the garden city to be delivered, and for there to be an opportunity to do it at a level that the scheme viability creates a surplus after a certain amount of time to do the things that we do. So the public sector presents the best opportunities, and what it really needs is a proactive local authorities working together in some instances, forming development corporations. The New Towns Act is still on the books, and it needs some tidying up, it needs some modernising, but it's still possible, and they present the best opportunity. The other opportunities, in my opinion, and colleagues in government don't necessarily follow this, is there's a huge amount of publicly owned land. Now, every one of the new towns and the garden cities paid back its debt with a major profit. So Milton Keynes, for example, paid back the money it received from the government many years early. So they are almost like long-term patient investments. This is why people like Legal and General and people like that are interested in the garden city movement. And if publicly owned land, such as Ministry of Defence land, for example, National Health owns a lot of land, was able to be brought forward for some of these schemes, and for there to be an appreciation that the government is not going to get its full market value immediately, but over time it will, as they did with the new towns, then we have a chance there as well. So there's a couple of different avenues, but it does need very proactive politically at a local and national level.
Great. Thank you for being so thorough with the answers. We have a comment, and then yeah, well, okay, let me just quickly go through this. So Lamar said it is very impressive how Letchworth has been able to retain their own freehold property stock and mass and reinvest the money back into the community rather than the money going into the companies outside the area. And then we have a couple of more questions if you have time.
Of course, as long as you need.
So Michael Hudson, he's our vice chair at the Ndsa, is saying thank you. And could I ask a bit more about how the planning application process works? For instance, with the uniqueness of Letchworth, what happens when the application lands on your desk? How do you remain objective with them? Assume there is a design criteria. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
No, that's fine. Was there a part two? I'll scribble. Yeah. Part two.
And that goes, secondly, contemporary architectural interventions. How do you encourage buildings of our current time, avoiding 3 chocolate box vernacular replicas?
Yeah, I'll do it in reverse because it's one of my bugbears, as I'm sure you probably picked up when I was speaking, that the pastiche that we see in purporting to be garden city design. And it is a challenge in Letchworth. A lot of the local community have an expectation that if there's any development here, it looks as though it was built 100 years ago, which couldn't be further away from what Howard was advocating around contemporary, embracing new technology and so forth. So it is a challenge in existing places. We did an international design competition called Reimagining the Garden City a few years ago, 3 years ago. And that was 85 RIBA practices entered that. And it was a really interesting experiment to look at how somewhere could be master planned and designed to take on the best of the design values without, as you said, a replication of chocolate box housing. And we kind of did that to help inform some of our own developments, but also to show the country that it isn't about copying what was there in the past. We have some interesting times ahead of us because we have the first expansion of Letchworth in a generation for about 900 homes, single development, 900 homes, and there's about 400 dotted around. And we're starting to look at design principles and the approach that we would take for that. And it is a really interesting debate. We think that, I mentioned Derwentthorpe earlier, that's quite a nice sort of contemporary interpretation of New Earswick, which was designed by Parker and Unwin before Letchworth. I personally would love to see a very contemporary scheme, but where we are pushing development on our land to be different from elsewhere is around the standards. So if you build a home on our land, and you can go through all the various agreements, be it that they have a ground lease and then there's variations, so forth, we will insist on above average energy efficiency, so above building regs energy efficiency, above national guidance in terms of room sizes, a minimum garden size applied with a minimum amount of sunshine on that garden as well. Really important. There's no point in having a decent sized garden if it's horrible to be in. So we lifetime homes compliance on everything 10-year blind, renewable energy beyond building regs, all of these sort of things we insist on if we allow development, either if we promote development on our land or if somebody comes to us with a scheme, perhaps where they have a ground lease and they want to release the covenants. So we will require that. So as well as trying to encourage good design, and we've just actually appointed an architectural, well-known, I haven't quite signed the contract yet, so I won't say who it is, well-known architectural practice to help us on this very, very topic, because I think we do need help. So as well as the architectural approach, trying to take the best of Garden City design without being a slavish copy, we want to make sure the standards are better than elsewhere, which is really going back to what Barry Parker was doing with his building standards back in the day. On applications, so we have to submit plan applications to the council, which has its ups and downs, as it does everywhere. I've been a town planner for, goodness knows, 30 years. We have the challenges and the good times and the opportunities as well, working with the local authority. Our scheme of management is entirely separate from the planning process. So, and we have a set of design guidance that we use to determine those applications. So when I said about windows, hard standings, as well as extensions and so forth, and we have differentiated between the heritage character area. We have a series of homes of special interest, so the most important properties. Then we have a modern area where we're a little bit more flexible. But I've been pushing for some time, and we've got a number of changes in to give a greater flexibility, because it's so important that homes are livable. And that's a big shift that we have undertaken over recent years.
Thank you. Josh, is it okay if you switch on your camera and you ask these questions yourself? Because I just want to open encourage everyone else to do so.
Sure.
Hi, Josh.
Evening, everyone. So my question, I think you've perhaps begun to cover it already, but I guess it's kind of looking at how garden cities that are, of a stature such as Letchworth are beginning to kind of develop and utilize and incorporate contemporary technologies, if that's one of the founding principles from Howard. One example might be triple glazing within buildings, in terms of kind of bringing that up to kind of contemporary spec. And to follow on from that, how is Letchworth, or does it have a current plan for delivering a carbon zero environment over the next 20 to 30 years? And I guess you started with that, but do you have anything in place?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of how we deal with existing properties, the heritage properties, we worked before all the madness of the last 18 months or so. We were working with the BRE, and we created we got back a cottage, so a 1920s cottage solid wall construction, and we did an eco home project with the BRE. And Wilmot Dixon as well, who are sort of major building contractor. They have an office in Letchworth, and we worked with them. And one of the sorry, it just flashed up. Tottenham have just scored. Sorry, that's why I do apologise. So we were working with them, and we created an eco home project where we started to investigate the efficacy of some of the measures. For example, external cladding. We're not a great fan of external cladding because it impacts on the appearance, but also the actual performance of the property, damp problems and so forth. we need some convincing, but we have done a lot of work on internal insulation solutions, but providing the correct ventilation. As you said, windows. Up until a few years ago, we didn't allow plastic windows in some of the heritage area. Now we've worked with a window company, and there are now systems in place, UPVC windows that you would not know they're UPVC, including the correct joinings and so forth. So so mechanical joints, for example, on those, which wasn't previously the case. So we do try to work with these organisations to try to benefit the homeowners, but we still have a lot to do. We still have an awful lot to do. In terms of a carbon zero Letchworth, we're currently, one of the things which got stalled a little bit in the last 18 months or so was that work. We do have a sustainability strategy. We are working with the local authority around the climate emergency, and it kind of picks up several areas with us because of the type of the extent of our estate. We have how we deal with our own buildings, many of which are highly inefficient. That cinema burns energy like crazy.
Yeah, I can imagine it does.
So how we manage those. So there's a responsibility on us. How we can help homeowners. New housing. We've said before, we're pushing beyond building regs. If you want to build anything in Letchworth, one of the aspects of the 900 unit scheme is going to be a recreation of that exhibition cottages called Innovation Street. And that is going to be pushing the boundaries of what can be done whilst making it affordable. This is the big thing for us. We want to make sure that can be lived in, but also where we have opportunities, our 2,500 acre rural estate and how we look after that. Signed up with Natural England on the Countryside Stewardship Plus scheme. So field margins or wildflower, all of those that our farming partners, farming tenants have had to sign up to certain requirements in terms of the way they farm the land. And we are looking at underutilized areas of land where we're starting to plant significant woodland. So there's a former depot next to one of the main roads that we're skimming the Woodland Trust on how we can do that. So we can take quite an estate-wide approach, but I think it's fair to say it's one of the areas we do need to do a lot more work on. We're hoping to make some appointments. If I get my business plan through the board in the next couple of months, we're going to make some appointments who will really be able to take a lead on that.
Excellent. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you. Martin, would you like to unmute yourself and ask away?
Hi, Martin.
Hello. I wondered if, like many councils, you spend a great deal of time bidding for pots of different funding, which can really drain resources.
Yeah, so there's lots of pots. We're not a local authority, so we're a private organisation, so we work alongside the council. But I think it's fair to say that because for many years we're very financially strong, we didn't worry too much about outside pots, which I think always found to be a bit of a weakness of the organisation. One of the outputs of COVID is that we're, like everybody else, scurrying around trying to pick up pots for various things. And we have gained some success. So, for example, when we were at our deepest trouble, our museum services was supported by the Arts Council. They kept us going. They're funding a member of staff at the moment. And as I mentioned, work with organisations like Natural England, the Woodland Trust, organisations such as that. For the bigger pots, say like Future High Streets, those sorts of things, we have to work closely with the local authority and the Business Improvement District, which we support. But we are hoping to appoint a fundraising manager in the next 12 months to really get underneath where the opportunities are, both in terms of jumping in, trying to get those pots, but also around volunteering as well. It's a huge untapped resource. Lots of people around here who want to do stuff to help, and we don't really use them very much. We have people work our community gardens, but around our museum services, looking after our greenway, for example, huge opportunities there, and funding which can sit alongside it. So a bit like where we were talking about the carbon question, we are doing some work in that area, but an opportunity to do more, and we need to get the right staff in place to support that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much, David. This has been a very useful discussion, actually, and there's a lot of interest amongst the audience. We were wondering if you have ever considered a drone mapping of the city. And I say this because we have a qualified licensed drone operator as well on the team.
Yeah, I think that we have done some work in that regard. There is some of that, but yeah, I think that it would be nice. I think that would be a positive thing to do that at a more comprehensive level. Definitely, yes, indeed.
Okay, we might get in touch then. Okay, if there's anyone else who'd like to unmute themselves or ask a question, or we could wrap it up. Yeah, well, okay. Well, thank you so much. I did have a comment towards the beginning of your presentation. You shared, and I think the theme was recurred over the course of the presentation, but the focus on a local goods, local farming, local economy, and I think it really ties in with the the sustainability agenda, where we're now, especially in the UK, now worried about Brexit and how we're going to get the goods across, and if things are going to be more expensive, as well as just focusing on local materials. I think I feel like there's a lot of potential which can tie in with especially with the REBA 2030 challenge.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe, and you did mention that there is an architect on board for you guys to sort of, reevaluate wherever you need reevaluation, of course.
Yes.
But I think there's definitely lots to share with others, and I wonder if there is any document or a case study that could be shared, or any link that you could share with us later on, maybe.
Yes. It was really because community gardening and urban agriculture, with the whole thing around food was the bit of Howard's model that never worked, and I think it was of some frustration. It's one of the reasons that and if anyone's involved in town planning, Thomas Adams was the first sort of chief executive equivalent. He then went on to form the Town Planning Institute, and he one of the reasons why I was in, because he came from a farming background as well as many other skills, and they never quite got it to work. They couldn't quite get it to work in terms of this local food production, both around that agricultural belt. Like it is farmed, but it doesn't necessarily directly feed the town. It provides an important income which helps support the town, as well as on those, because they deliberately landlocked areas behind the rear of groups of houses in the master plan so that they could be used for nothing else other than amenity and food. And that's a real sort of important part. Developers don't do that anymore. They don't deliberately landlock areas, and Park and Unwin did, but it never quite got to the point where it's feeding itself. When we did the design competition, which is the bit I'm coming to, sorry, I put in as one of the core values and principles that it should include community gardening and food in there. So there is and I'll send you the link for that competition, because we've still got it live, and you can still look at the thoughts of the shortlisted 4 entries around this very question, around the whole thing around Garden City principles, but also one of the core areas was around food production. We do a lot of work with the University of Hertfordshire, and Dr. Susan Parham is quite an expert on sort of the whole area of urban agriculture and sustainable sort of modern living. And she was part of the panel and made a sort of significant contribution on that. But that's all we've kind of got at the moment. But I will send you that and have a look and see if it's any use to you.
Sure. Thank you. I think we could wrap it up now. It's been a long evening. Thank you for everyone who's stayed with us up till now. And thank you very much for your questions. This was actually one of the most engaged evenings. And thank you, David.
It's an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed. It's a shame I'm not with you in person, and maybe we can do it another time together. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen in, and I hope it's useful. And as I said, do look us up, and if you want to come to Letchworth, let me know. Sure, thank you. We'll get in touch. And for the audience, I think, as I mentioned earlier, you can follow up on the events on our website. It will be the video will be uploaded very soon. It's called ndsa.org.uk. Thank you so much. Lovely. Thank you very much, everyone.